Welcome to the Professional Practice Podcast series. In association with The Lawyer, in this episode, we will discuss our key findings of our latest 2020 law firm survey. I'm Giles Murphy, Head of Professional Practices at Smith & Williamson. And with me today is Roger Wagland, Head of Research at The Lawyer. So welcome, Roger.
Hi, Giles. Nice to see you.
It would be difficult to argue against the claim that 2020 has so far been the most significant year within the legal industry since our annual law firm survey began back in 1994. Those that weathered the 2008 financial crisis must have thought that they'd seen the defining event of their career and have now been proven wrong by the most significant global pandemic since the 1990 Spanish flu outbreak and the largest market crash since the Great Depression, which followed a decade later. If that wasn't enough, the end of 2020 will see our trading arrangements with the world change as the Brexit transition agreement comes to an end. So plenty for our survey respondents to cover. Roger, over to you.
Thank you, Giles. As you say, it's been quite a year. And what I noticed from the survey responses is that confidence amongst law firms seems to remain high despite all the challenges that they have faced.
Yeah, I think that was probably the biggest surprise from the survey, with a total of 80% of respondents feeling reasonably confident or very confident about the future. And that does seem to contrast with the world that we've been living in over the last few months. It's certainly higher than the levels that we saw in 2008, the sort of peak of the issues of the global financial crisis. And I suppose it begs the question of why are firms feeling that confident? Blind optimism, of course, could be one. Of course, perhaps slightly more helpfully, what we've got is a level of management who probably were around during the global financial crisis, and therefore one might conclude that they have experience that they think can sail their ship through these difficult times. Of course, the other factor is that we've perhaps forgotten all too quickly how frightening the end of March, early April was as the country went into lockdown. And given the survey took place in May and June, perhaps simply the fact that firms had survived that initial period gave people a bit of confidence about the future.
That's interesting. Although I would also note we had the record number of responses to this survey, which certainly shows that people were tuned in to the questions that we were asking. On a follow-up point, I also noticed that despite the level of confidence being high, respondents also felt that the competitive pressure was increasing.
Yes, I think this is a consistent theme we've seen over the years, although those that thought that competition had increased in the year was actually down slightly on the previous year. My sense is this question is often answered from people very much viewing the short term, how they feel there and then. And undoubtedly the marketplace is a very competitive place in which to operate. Perhaps most interestingly was the response to where's the competition coming from. By some significant majority, people are talking about the usual suspects, their direct competitors, as being the principal issue to them. And we're not seeing much talk about new entrants to the market, which indeed I would include, the larger accountancy firms, which have clearly set out a strategy to attack the legal market. And yet that doesn't seem to come through as a threat in our survey results. Competition
out there, they certainly seem to be concerned about their co-firms from a competition perspective. On another issue, though, I noticed that there was significant change in the responses for the question around geographical expansion this year.
Yeah, I think expansion generally. I mean, more than 60% of respondents indicated that they're not looking for an M&A or team hire over the next year, and that's significantly up from last year's 35%. It's a similar story, as you mentioned, in relation to geographical expansion, with 65% of this year's respondents not looking to expand geographically at all. So there's very much a sense that firms are battening down the hatches. They're working with what they've got. They're protecting what they've got, which of course is a natural reaction to what we've been through. Although it perhaps begs the question whether firms are being a bit too short-term, because whenever there is distress in a market, there will be opportunities out there. And of course, for the braver firm, the more confident firms, there may be opportunities to acquire good quality partners, teams, or indeed other firms broadly at a price which would be cheaper than otherwise would be the case. So question whether firms are just missing out on that opportunity.
Although, do you see them maybe focusing on different types of investment this year, such as technology?
Yes, I think technology has been a core interest, area of focus for a number of years. What's interesting this year is where the focus is on, and no one will be surprised that the focus is going to be on remote working, video conferencing, collaboration, communication. Clearly, that's flavour of the month at the moment. I think most firms would reflect with a sense of relief how well their systems have held up in the working from home environment. But I think a lot of them have realised that there are opportunities there to actually take that to a next level if they invest. One thing we have seen is that investment in cybersecurity is much further down the list. And if we go back last year, the year before, our survey showed this as being a key risk to the business and therefore a key area of investment. And perhaps a slight concern there that while remote working will undoubtedly stay with us, of course, that does increase the risk around cybersecurity. And if anything, firms should be focusing on and investing more in that area.
Indeed. And I noticed, again, from the responses, maybe the decrease in cybersecurity is just one of where the immediate focus is. And although it wasn't picked as one of the most important areas, it still receives significant investment. But moving on to possibly one of your favourite topics, Giles, lockup. Have you seen any significant shift in firms' attitudes towards that?
Unfortunately not. And anyone who's watched previous videos, podcasts regarding the survey results, perhaps we could just play last year's outtake from that, because it's a very similar theme. Firms are still very thinly capitalised, and as we've always said, and indeed in a slightly prophetic way last year, said that low levels of cash balances within firms are fine when business is stable and consistent and easily predictable. But we did say last year that, of course, there may well be some shocks around the corner. Actually, last year it was all about Brexit, US foreign policy. I'm not claiming that we predicted the pandemic, but unfortunately, as the pandemic hit and firms felt under significant financial pressure, if only they had got their lock-up in order, it would have put them in a much safer position, much more secure position to make longer-term decisions about their business. And I fear that if firms don't take the experiences of the last few months as a tool to improve lock-up, then bluntly, this is a war that's never going to be won.
Well, yeah, I would feel that it's a very powerful lesson for firms over these last few months. I mean, if we turn our attention to the impact of the coronavirus, the survey shows there's quite a large number of firms took advantage of government schemes. Yeah,
I mean, it's quite interesting. Certainly when our Chancellor stood up and announced the furlough scheme, I think most people, myself included, interpreted this as being directed at the sectors most vulnerable. Hospitality, obvious one, restaurant trade, cinema trade, etc. I don't think the Chancellor had professional services in mind, but of course the simplicity of the scheme was one of its attractiveness, and it meant that anyone could apply. And in our survey, over 70% of respondents indicated that their firm had taken advantage of furloughing, albeit some with relatively small numbers of staff. But of course, some has been well publicised, particularly the lawyer, to a much greater extent. And I do find that a little bit troubling, because the sector is an extremely profitable sector, one that generates a lot of return. And if only firms had better financial management and better cash balances, they wouldn't have felt the need to furlough staff. And I think it's just one indication of perhaps how precarious firms thought their position was in late March, early April. One of the particularly interesting statistics that we've drawn from the survey this year is that with 70% of firms saying that they had furloughed staff, only 60% said that they had reduced partner drawings. And I think that will leave the profession, certainly those firms, with an interesting reputational conundrum there as to whether they will be seen as taking government money simply to support partner profit shares and drawings from the business.
Although I noticed, fortunately, that redundancies so far have been reported as very, very low.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the positives that the furlough scheme has created, is that it has deferred that decision for a lot of firms while at least they work out what type of business shape that they're in. I think obviously with the furlough scheme coming to an end this October, it's going to be interesting to see how firms respond. I think there are probably two areas that will come under scrutiny. One is services that they provided that they perhaps don't now currently need. I mean, the obvious areas are sort of facilities, front of house, people like that, if people aren't using offices as much. And then there's just the general volume of work. And clearly, if firms believe they've got excess resource, then once the furlough scheme comes to an end, people might be exposed to that.
Indeed. Just picking up on your final comment there, you mentioned the types of staff, and looking at our survey, what conclusions did you draw from responses around office space?
Yeah, I think it'll be no surprise to people to hear that actually a lot of lawyers used to work almost predominantly from the office, and going forwards, a lot of lawyers expect to be operating on a more remote basis. I think the experience for a lot of people has been really quite sort of groundbreaking in terms of, work-life balance, the ability to interact still with clients and colleagues. But I'm not one to signal the end of the office yet. I think the remote working has worked incredibly effectively in a crisis situation. But I think longer term, we need to think about how we engage with our clients, with our colleagues, the importance of relationship building. And no matter how good Zoom, MS Teams, WebEx are, I think we'd all reflect that it's hard to build relationships over those sorts of mediums. So I'm one that believes that actually the office is still a core part of any firm's strategy. How they use that will change. And I think that's going to be the interesting issue that's going to emerge from this pandemic.
I would certainly agree with that sentiment. From my own experiences, I think we're very keen to get back to our office. However, I think it will be on a more infrequent basis, maybe 1 or 2 days a week.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of model that a lot of people are looking at. I mean, I reflect just on the anecdotal evidence that we have is that, when you talk to people in an office environment, they often talk about the friendships, the bonds they create. You rarely hear someone as a leaving speech say, gosh, what I'm really going to miss is the technical work. Invariably, they talk about the friendships that they will miss. And those come about from being physically in an office, not communicating over Microsoft Teams.
Absolutely.
So thank you everyone who took part in the survey and also for listening to this podcast. All links and references spoken about in this episode can be found in the episode show notes. Please do subscribe and rate and review S&W The Pulse in the App Store.
This S&W The Pulse podcast is of a general nature and is not a substitute for professional advice. No responsibility can be accepted for the consequences of any action taken or refrained from as a result of what is said. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the presenter or of Smith & Williamson or any of its affiliates. No reproduction of this podcast may be made in whole or in part for professional or recreational purposes. No action should be taken based on this podcast. We accept no liability if we change your views on any of the subjects mentioned. Smith & Williamson LLP, regulated by the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales for a range of investment business activities, a member of Nexia International.